How about we do this with nothing more than a swivel knife and a modeling spoon? That's coming up. Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Reese. This is Weaver Leather Supply. Today, we're going to be taking on the challenge of carving this Nordic style wolf with nothing more than a swivel knife and a modeling spoon. Now, before we go too far, I know that this isn't a traditional Nordic wolf. When I designed it, I just wanted it to resemble something from that culture, not necessarily be accurate and authentic. So, what actually inspired or prompted this challenge today? Well, one, anytime we can challenge ourselves when it comes to the swivel knife is probably going to be a good thing. There's always the opportunity to level up our skills. Number two, Weaver just got in a bunch of brand new swivel knife blades, and we're going to be using three of them for the challenge today. So if you want to take on the challenge with me, I would definitely encourage you to do that. We're going to put a link in the description. It'll take you straight to the free pattern. You can take on the challenge with me. Now, if you decide to do that, I would really encourage you to share it. My partner here, Chuck Dorset, has a fan page on Facebook. It's called the Chuck Dorset fan page. And if you're comfortable and you want to share it, it's a great group of people to share it with. You're not going to get anything but positive feedback and encouragement. Would definitely encourage you to share it in that group and tag me in it. I would love to see how your project turned out. If you've done any kind of leather carving at all, you've probably used a traditional straight blade. It's the one that we all start out with. Well, today we're going to talk about multiple options and the flexibility and the capability that comes with them. First up on the list are going to be straight blades, and this is the one that we all start out with. They're fantastic at long, straight cuts. There's a couple of different styles. You've got the traditional and the hollow ground. Hollow ground's just narrower in the middle of the blade than it is on the cutting end of it. What's the difference? Well, in my experience, the traditional, where it's just a straight blade, that tends to widen the cut more, whereas a hollow ground tends to give us a more narrow cut. These blades have a simple, straight design, and they're great for most cuts that you're going to need to do, especially those long, straight cuts like tooling windows, which is what I'm going to be using it for first. One of the benefits to a straight blade is that it has two sides, two cutting sides, which means you don't have to strop it as much. You just flip the blade around and use the other end of it. So one of the things I really like about this blade from Weaver is how wide it is. That really opens up that cut, and it's fantastic for things like that tooling window and the main features around the wolf. We want those to be really bold and wide, where some of the more delicate cuts on the inside, we want those more precise and narrow. This one is fantastic for really opening up that cut. So I've already mentioned a couple of times that the straight blade is fantastic for long straight cuts or more sloping curves. But what about those really tight turns? Well, a long straight blade can be a real challenge to get in there and make those tight turns. So what you're going to want for that is one that's not as wide or an angled blade. So what's so special about an angled blade? Well, basically, we're using just the tip, and the rest of the blade is pulling back and getting out of the way. When we're using a straight blade, the blade kind of gets in the way of itself sometimes on those really tight turns, and that doesn't happen as much or as easily with an angled blade. I'm going to use this angled blade for all the interior cuts, and one of the reasons is that angled blades tend to create a narrower cut. Not all the time, but most of the time. And that's going to be really important for those cuts in this design that are really close together. As you're going through and you're cutting in the fur, typically you're going to have a blunt end to the cut and a tapered end. It's usually going to be easiest to pull from the blunt end to the tapered end. Now, I don't always get to do that because I'm trying to work so that the camera has a good angle too, But when you're working on yours, the easiest cut is typically going to be from the blunt end to the tapered end. Just start to lighten up on that cut about halfway through. That way you get that nice tapered fade. Now that we've got all the swivel knife work done, I'm going to go back with my modeling spoon and I'm going to use this to create shadows. All I'm doing is I'm going to drag it over the leather and I want it to kind of ride like a boat in the water. When you look at a boat, one end's higher than the other end, and that's what I want to do with the modeling spoon. The leading edge is going to be on the higher point and the following edge is going to be lower. And what this is going to do for us, it gives us an easy way to create shadows, and we want to use those shadows to emphasize certain areas of the design, like around the muzzle and under the brow. We can also use it around that tooling window to really differentiate the tooled area from that border. The other thing that we want to do with the modeling spoon is use it to create shadows. So if you think of a light source coming from the top, the shadows are all going to be on the bottom. If the light source is coming from my right, all the shadows are going to be on the left. So when you go in and you create yours, in your mind, pick a light source. What direction is the light coming from? And practice making sure that the shadows are always opposite your light source. So next and last, we're going to be talking about hair blades. Now, if you're not familiar with what a hair blade is, it typically looks like this. You've got a bit on each end of it, and those bits have lines, parallel lines cut into it. One's going to be coarse, one's going to be fine, and essentially it's going to give you two different hair textures. Now, you can use it for other things besides hair, stuff like wood grain and feathers. They're fantastic for both of those, but essentially it creates parallel lines that you can use to create different effects. Now, why is it such a big deal to be able to put a hair blade into a swivel knife? Well, typically these things want to run in straight lines. Parallel blades essentially want to cut straight parallel lines. They don't want to curve. Well, when we drop it into a swivel knife, that gives us more control over it, and it gives us the ability to really create flow within those lines. The project's looking really good, but it needs a little bit of color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to match it to the pattern. And around the eyes, the nose, and a little bit where the mouth is black in the pattern. So that's what I'm going to do. Then I'm going to follow it up by antiquing it. So before we actually put the antique on there, it's going to be really important that we seal it. And anytime I have paint on a project, I'm going to use 2 different sealers if I'm antiquing it. And here's what I mean. I've got the black paint on there. Well, if I go straight in with tan coat, there's a good chance that that tan coat's just going to lift some of the paint off of it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to use aerosol leather sheen. That's a non-contact sealer. Essentially, I can spray it on there and I don't have to touch it. But I can't do it on camera because my workshop is in my house. So I'm going to do that off camera, but 4 to 5 coats, that's going to give us a really good protected surface that we can then put our tan coat on. Now, why would we want to use leather sheen, then tan coat? Well, leather sheen protects the paint. Tan coat is going to act as a resist. So that's going to keep the antique from seeping down into the actual grain of the leather and allow it just to sit in those recessed areas that we created with the swivel knife and the modeling spoon. I wanted a nice bold look to this antique, so after I put all the antique on there, I let it sit out in the sun for about 5 minutes. That kind of speeds up the setting process. Then I came back and buffed it off the top. After I've buffed it off and it's looking really good, well, I'm going to put one more coat of tan coat on there. Now, the reason I do this is because antique can kind of muddy up the project a little bit. Going over it with a really light coat of tan coat freshens it up, brightens it up, and it locks all that antique in place so it shouldn't come off later. So if you want to take on this challenge, I would love to see it. Make sure that you post it in the group, Chuck Dorsett fan page. Tag me in it. I would love to see your projects and how they turned out. That's going to do it for this video. I will see you in the next one. In the meantime, go make something amazing.